Hey, Aaron.
Hey, Brendan. I'm going to go see if I can find a quieter place, but I may be back at my desk in a second here.
Hey, Joe.
How are all y'all doing?
Doing well. Beautiful day in San Francisco.
It's a little hazy here. I can see our containers from our office, so I keep an eye on them. Like the container port.
Right.
Hey, you're really laggy, Brandon. I don't know if it's you or if it's the fact that I upgraded to Mojave.
My audio might be laggy because I'm using my phone. I just don't trust computers for audio anymore.
Mojave works great for me. No problems.
Yeah, no problems here either. But there's a little lag, I guess.
All right, we're 5 minutes in here.
I guess I can go ahead and bosun us, whatever it is. Brandon, thank you for taking notes, as always. So I kind of want us to run through the board first and then get to the rest of the topics that we added last minute to the agenda, if that's cool with everybody.
Sounds good report.
So I will share my screen so we're all looking at the same thing. All right. So in the blocked waiting column, there was a question about sunset procedure for, stupid thing here. The Zoom bar always blocks tabs whenever I open them up. So there was a question when it came to George and Paris are working on the process to sunset SIGs in working groups. They realized that this file basically should probably just be renamed like SIG lifecycle. So it's just the logistics and administrivia of how you clean up a SIG. But then we kind of realized this file is also called SIG governance, not unlike the SIG governance template that we linked to. And if you look at the top here, there's a bunch of stuff here that sounds an awful lot like SIG roles and responsibilities that I feel like we should move into the SIG governance charter. So I or somebody can take an action item, I think, where the steering committee agree that this section gets removed and folded into SIG governance, and then this just turns into a lifecycle doc. Does that sound good to everybody? I'm not
Sounds
hearing
reasonable
no.
to me.
Yes,
Okay.
that sounds good. I think there's an open issue to, like an open GitHub issue somewhere about merging those two.
Yeah, so that's what I had linked to. I just put it on our blocked column to talk about that. On the formalizing sub-projects issue, there basically seems to be some consternation around the fact that right now sub-projects are more or less just a collection of, good Lord, this is a trail of things to follow. Sub-projects are just a collection of owners' files, and some people get confused by this, especially those SIGs that are more or less just process or non-code related, so things like SIG PM, sometimes some sub-projects of SIG release, and some sub-projects of SIG contributor experience. The stuff that I've said in the past is that even if you are a process-only sub-project, you should still probably document what your process is, put that document someplace, and then drop an owner's file in that. But I get that as human beings, people are not really enjoying the whole owner's file thing because they can't, like, it looks terrible, basically. If I were to go through, let's use the sub-projects for my SIG as an example. Like, this is not super clear to people, and it's also not clear who the actual human beings are and who to contact. You have to actually click through to these files, and it's not super friendly. So Stephen Augustus had something out to try and change it from owners' files to actual human beings. I'm pushing back on this because I think it's going to fall even more out of date than it's already likely to fall out of date with the current owners' files. There needs to be somebody owning the automation. I thought it was going to be me, but I really haven't had the bandwidth to do this. So I'm happy to farm it out to somebody else. Or I let Stephen continue and unblock him. I had thought that this maybe could be a topic for discussion at SIG architecture. So I guess one thing I'm asking the steering committee here is if they're comfortable delegating this discussion to SIG architecture.
Why SIG architecture? That seems like the wrong thing to me.
Because I feel like it's about the organization of code within the project. But maybe this is the appropriate forum to have the discussion. I don't think it's really actionable right now.
Okay, so part of the point of pointing to owners files was to actually identify where the artifacts are that relate to the subprojects.
Right.
So just listing humans, I think, would be a step backwards from that point of view. I do think it would be helpful to centralize the list of approvers and reviewers for the subprojects and just refer to those in the individual owners files. So it doesn't have to be duplicated and kept in sync. Like the last time I looked, we had something like 5,000 owners files, which is way too many. We need to reduce the number of owners files and the number of unique lists of people, because otherwise just keeping them up to date is all that much harder, and understanding who to contact and so on is all that much harder.
Okay. All right. Maybe we can pick that back up when we talk about Dim's thing to formalize owners files. But yeah, I agree. I feel like there should be some combination of automation that scrapes the actual people out of that and pulls the contact info into README.
Is
now.
there a mailing list where this discussion is happening? I just can't function on GitHub if this is just being pinged between different GitHub issues. There's no way I can find them.
I think it's pinged between different GitHub issues, but I can send you an email with more details about this, and we can have this discussion maybe in the context of SIG contributor experience. I don't want to take too much more time on it.
Okay, thanks.
So documenting what working groups are and how to form and disband them. I think we're almost done here. I think Phil had a follow-up PR, if I remember right. There was a question from SIG contributor experience. They'd really like to see us formally specify that working groups have to be tied to SIGs and that we should call out those SIGs in SIG's YAML so that we can generate this as part of a working group's documentation. So if a working group happens to span SIG release and SIG testing, we know that as a community and it would be easier for us. Right now, SIG sponsorship is called out as part of the working group formation process, so I feel like it's not super controversial if we formalize this. Do people agree?
The one thing that was a little weird was, do we need a charter for a working group?
So this isn't necessarily about saying all working groups have charters, but working groups do need to have SIGs tied to them. Working groups by their very nature are efforts that span across multiple SIGs.
Yeah, I get that. I'm just, your submission of your particular K8s infra working group was
Sure.
different than every other working group. So
we can get to that when we get to that. So just the tangent on that was, those of us in the K8s infra working group felt like it was really important to be very formal and precise since this is about running project infrastructure. We wanted to make sure there were clear things like how decisions are made, how members are voted in, how we do leadership changes and such. And a lot of the language in the SIG governance template already had all of that information in there. So we felt like it was easy to just reuse that and then overlay the specific changes for us as a working group. I'm happy to copy paste all of that directly into our README, but since I had just written up a charter for SIG testing, that's the pattern I followed for the working group. We can review that when we get there.
So Aaron,
yes.
When we specify the list of SIGs for the working group,
yes.
Basically what we are saying that is, if things change in the working group and something else, they need to talk to somebody else and interact with somebody else, then they'll update this document.
Yeah, I think so. It's just, if we're talking about how working groups are these things that span SIGs, what are the SIGs that a working group spans? I suspect if you were to go and look at the working groups that exist today, you might not be able to answer that question.
Yeah, it should reflect, the work being done, I guess.
Right.
So I'm happy with that.
Okay. On the charters meta issue, I think y'all had agreed last week to go through and notify a bunch of SIGs that charters are due. So I got SIG testing's charter merged through. Thank you, Brendan and Divs, for the review. Tim and I reviewed the SIG multi-cluster charter. It looks super specific and super light, it just calls a couple repos, but it's good enough for now. SIG AWS had a charter out there. I think, even though I'm not an official reviewer on this, it mostly looked good to me, except at the end, it seems like they copy-pasted a bunch of roles and organization management stuff instead of overlaying their specific changes. Brandon and I have some concerns on this. Joe, maybe you want to follow up and see if this makes any sense to you or if you know what the deal is there. How are we doing on sort of notifying the rest of these SIGs? I personally haven't gone through and chased down SIG Big Data or SIG Windows and stuff. Do we feel like we need to keep pushing on this? Are we still trying to have all of these charters merged by KubeCon, that sort of thing?
Which one did you want me to check out? Sorry, I missed that.
SIG AWS.
Okay, I'll dig into that. It was in progress, but it was stalled out.
Yeah, it seems like it's stalled out.
I'll ping the SIG Windows folks.
Okay.
I can ping the API machinery folks.
Who is that? Sorry. Who's pinging
That was
SIG Windows? Dan?
Brendan.
Okay.
Brendan.
So maybe as a follow-up, I can check in to see where we are at with the SIGs that are completely missing charters next week. There are also a couple SIGs that have charters in process but aren't quite ready for review. And then there's SIGs who got charters merged in, but they didn't really go through the whole template that we have now. SIG contributor experience was one of those SIGs, so they're working through that at the moment. Brendan, maybe you could kick SIG Azure about that, and I can try kicking SIG PM to see if they can reconcile their charter. Does anybody have any other charter-related progress to talk about?
Aaron, the OpenStack one, I believe the last thing that we were talking about was folding that back into SIG Cloud Provider. I have to go back and chase the SIG leads to see what the current plan is.
Okay. Yeah, it kind of wasn't clear to me whether or not we wanted to have all the SIGs land their charters before we thought about this reconciliation effort.
Right, there's no point writing it up if it's not.
Yeah, if SIG OpenStack would rather just fold, I think that's appropriate if everybody else here on steering agrees with that.
The only question I had there was, does it need to get converted into a working group or something, or just disband it?
Well, it would be a sub-project of the cloud provider SIG, I would assume.
Okay, that makes sense.
But along those lines, big data really should be a working group. Like they're never going to own any code in the Kubernetes project. Okay.
All right. Well, let's follow up on all of this by next week and take a look. James, maybe you and I can see if merging SIG OpenStack into SIG Cloud Provider is something that's covered in these docs that are being worked on here as far as logistics, so we can guinea pig those.
Okay.
Ensuring all Kubernetes repos follow the same contributing structure. I'm just going to put that into blocked right now because there's some disagreement about whether or not we are polluting root with too many files. There's also an item here about DCO versus CLA. I'm not actually sure what we have to talk about here. The legal benefits of CLA versus DCO. I feel like this is kind of settled. We want to stick with CLA thing, but does anybody know?
No, there was supposed to be a lawyer fight. We were supposed to invite folks to this meeting, and they're full-on lawyer fight. So I'm gonna get some popcorn, and we would sit back and have them
Duke it out.
But I don't think even in terms of contributor experience, I don't think a strong case has been made one way or the other. Right, like it's a trade-off, and DCO supposedly is claimed to be simpler for new contributors, whereas CLA is easier for contributors that work for a company that's already contributing.
Yeah,
which is the vast majority of our most productive contributors.
Right. The meta issue behind that was we were talking about was. Do we need to do better in terms of getting people who are occasional contributors, bring them more into the fold, so to say, than right now we are organized towards companies with full-time employees who, and their day job is Kubernetes, right?
So my general experience with this is that we need more productive contributors, not more contributors, right? Like, it's a software project, Mythical Man Month still applies. People who only contribute on weekends are going to have trouble keeping their PRs up to date and getting them merged. That's been a real struggle in the past. It's just until the project slows down enough, or if they're just like fixing very well-contained bugs, it's not going to be very friendly to occasional contributors, regardless of changes we make to DCO versus CLA.
So I feel like we don't, hang on. So I just don't think we really have the right people here to talk about this. If this is about getting the lawyer perspective, we should have the lawyer perspective. I feel like the contributor perspective has been hashed out on an issue that's not here, and I think there are more productive uses of our time. We can get back to this if we finish the rest of our list.
Yeah.
But I do want to address what Brian just said there. I think that for core parts of Kubernetes, like API machinery and stuff like that, I think you're probably right. But there are a ton of other sub-projects and ancillary projects that are much more amenable to folks actually, spending time on without it being a full-time job. So I think that's a narrow view. So I just want to make sure, because this is a philosophical thing, Aaron, in terms of who do we want, who's the community, who do we want to contribute, how wide is the community? I don't want to go into a ton of depth there right now, but I just want to get on the record with Brian that I think that that's probably a pretty narrow view.
Yeah, and to be clear, there are benefits of helping people contribute to the project. Getting stuff done faster is usually not one of them, right? But it does build the community. I agree with that.
They definitely both have different kinds of friction. I agree there's a philosophical thing. We probably do have some data out there. If you wanted to go plumb through DevStats, you could take a look at how many PRs are stuck because people refuse to sign the CLA. I know that doesn't necessarily show us how many people refuse to even open up a PR in the first place because of that, but you might at least get some data on how many contributions stall out because of that versus contributions that end up making it through.
Yeah, I would definitely want to dig into that, Aaron.
Okay.
I'll ping you later.
And yeah, I would like to better understand how DCO changes that as well.
Okay, so I think that's everything on the board. The next topic is SIG Cloud and parentless work around provider, and I believe this is something Tim added to the agenda. Tim, do you want to speak to it?
So for several releases now, I think greater than 2, the amount of public statements we made with regards to SIG cloud provider or cloud provider work would be moving out of tree has been numerous. Like we've said it many, many times that this is going to be the thing that's going to happen. The problem with that is that individual providers are not necessarily incentivized to make this thing happen, and it's not consistent across all of the work items that need to occur because it hits all the way across the project from the end-to-end test into the kubelet, into other parts of the code base. And I don't know how we incentivize folks to make this go, because right now the current state of things is ill-documented and, for better or for worse, just totally broken. So I don't exactly know how we make this type of change happen without some sort of centralized empowerment to make it happen.
So, Tim, didn't you and I have a discussion on this issue when talking about trying to force pull a Band-Aid on OpenStack and then realize that wasn't going to be possible due to SIG storage needs? So I guess, Tim, I'm not sure it's even fully understood everything that needed to be done in order to make it happen. In some cases, we tried to go make it happen and only realized after the fact that there was still yet more work not yet discovered to be done.
Exactly. The problem is it's sprawled so deep and wide, and there's no one empowered to make it go, right? Like a central authority who's the clearinghouse for these things.
So I want to understand what you mean.
I guess the point I had was I don't think we identified the full set of things that needed to be done to make it go. And so
I think actually the architecture of how it was designed wasn't designed for success to begin with, right? Like the whole idea that you could make all the cloud providers do something is just hard, right? Like we should have pulled the code into externalized the code first.
Yeah, I don't disagree, Brendan. All I was trying to call out was I feel like it's the wrong posture right now to say, how come it hasn't happened yet when we made an attempt to happen in this release and still found something fundamental on why it can't happen. So
Yeah, no,
the issue is that we want particular SIGs to take on actions earlier in subsequent releases. That's a different discussion, I guess.
Yeah, I want to empower folks. Oh, sorry, I already started talking. I want to empower folks to be able to do the work And the problem that I'm seeing from across several releases is the people who have started SIG Cloud don't have any characteristic mechanism to do enforcement to make sure that these things actually change over time. I'll stop talking.
Yeah, so SIG OpenStack is the one that is closest to getting out. The latest stumbling block that we found was that we can't drop support for the existing Cinder volumes API, and we need to support it somehow. And so I was able to flip the tables and say, okay, the code for OpenStack is going to go into the repository, and we'll vendor the cloud provider OpenStack repository back into the main KK repository just enough to support the Cinder use case. So I'm able to do that, but then there is a KEP that we wrote, and then there's a PR in progress, and I need to push it through to able to prove that it's possible. Brian, you had your hand up.
Well, I think Brendan was before me if he had something to say.
Yeah, I don't really have anything more to say other than to sort of agree with Derek that I don't think that we want to, we're not set up to push this. And maybe we should just admit that we're not going to push it.
Okay, well, so what I was going to say is that as far as I know, with respect to carrots or sticks, we actually do theoretically have mechanisms for that, and they have not been exercised. I don't think the cloud provider effort has ever come to SIG architecture, for example, to discuss the design or things that are blocking them. With etcd, that was simpler because it was effectively only had a couple of SIGs that were stakeholders, and we announced when we were going to deprecate it, and we made it happen. Our team specifically at Google has invested quite a bit in the cloud provider extraction. So we do want to make it happen and unblock the cloud providers that have not been able to add their support that's the top priority. Getting the rest of the provider specific code out is also important to me in the long run. I think that's a healthy thing for us as we try to contain scope and make it more of a kernel. But I haven't seen anything escalated to the SIG architecture forum, which seems like a better place for this particular issue than the steering committee.
Yeah, I'll take an action item. I'll line up the KEP for SIG architecture for the OpenStack one, and we can debate on that in the next SIG Arc meeting.
Okay, thanks. And by the way, I did also suggest that the CSI folks talk more to the cloud provider extraction folks because they have a lot of very similar issues, and it didn't seem like they had been talking.
Yeah, I was just kind of unclear when, Tim, you started talking about empowering, what authority is lacking that people don't already have. It seems as though your broader point is that cloud provider extraction isn't happening fast enough. How can we make that happen? And so one way is perhaps people are blocked and they need empowerment to unblock or push through things. Perhaps it's a question of insufficient resources being allocated to this effort versus other efforts, in which case you would talk about the community being empowered to push back against individual vendors pushing features. But I'm just not sure what you were asking there, and Brendan definitely has a very, very vocal hand raised.
Yeah, that's using my phone instead of my computer. We can't force people to write code is basically the problem, right? And so I think we have to realize that, and we have to structure our architectural decisions towards the notion that we can't force people to write code, as opposed to in a more single corporation setting where you potentially could force people to write code. I think that's the fundamental problem.
Just observing the people who are doing the work, Brendan, it's not that they lack. It's just that there are many cloud providers, and in each cloud provider, the people are at different stage of experimenting with the different things that are possible. So it's just getting consensus there in a single direction. Like I'm pushing in one direction, and then Andrew is pushing in another direction. So Andrew is pushing in the direction where we chop off things into staging, and then slowly over a period of time we'll get things out. And I was like, okay, just rip everything out and render main KK and use it, even if there is a recursive dependency between the KK and the cloud provider. So just getting everybody in sync in the same direction is the issue, and not that we are lacking top level approvers. That kind of stuff is not a problem right now.
Okay, sounds like we've said all we need to say there. So let's move on to the next topic, which is DIMS. You wanted to talk about the removal of out-of-date owners.
So it's not removal per se, it's more like getting them to assign other people who are currently not in owners as reviewers and approvers, and maybe take them out themselves if they are not doing active reviews. So the first step in that was trying to figure out who is active and who is not active. And I came up with an Excel sheet where I highlighted like 10 people saying, okay, can we see, So the basic idea was to go through the owners files and see how many files have the names of the people, and then look at the dev stats data to see how many of them are actually active in the last year or so. And then next step is, I don't want to go as an individual to ask them. I want like steering committee or contribX to approach these people and do it that way. And it's not like, okay, you're not doing anything, can you just get out? That's not the idea. It's more to encourage them to get more people into the owners files rather than taking people out. Aaron?
Yeah, my opinion is this would be a great thing for contributor experience to do. I feel like they own policy around owners files. I feel like they own the best messaging to the community. It's kind of unclear to me how much they own the individual roles within the contributor ladder, like reviewer versus approver, but I do think culturally as a project, we should be incentivizing everybody to help pull people up the ladder behind them. So even if it's not, so yeah, I think like reaching out to these people and asking contribX to come up with some sort of policy is the right forum. I'm not sure that steering has to be involved, so other than to say like we support it, would be my thing. Brian?
Yeah, and the intent when we created the reviewer approver split and the contributor ladder was to create a framework where people could be moved up the ladder, and that was driven primarily out of contributor experience. Although it's a little bit fuzzy because of, anyway, Garrett implemented a bunch of that, but where it fell down was there wasn't a consolidated push to get, to sort of educate the reviewers and approvers about what they need to do to make the ladder really work and to help people move up the ladder. So that's where I feel like it sort of fell down. And we do have some straw man documented criteria in the documents, but we've never really, other than for initial membership, we've never really exercised those criteria in any significant way.
Yeah. There are also some aspirational best practices for how to tend and maintain owners files, but we lack any automation that can effectively automate or display the health and freshness of them. Joe, you have your hand up.
So, I mean, I love, the idea of kicking this stuff off to stuff like contribX, but contribX is essentially unfunded from sort of a toolability point of view, right? There's a ton of stuff that I think they'd love to build tools around across a whole bunch of stuff, but the set of folks that are heavily involved there just are not set up to do that. I've encouraged George to try and maybe like product manage some of these things around where do we want automation, let's find the priorities, and then maybe we can, do help wanted or perhaps, appeal to the CNCF to actually help us get some contractors to actually help write some of this toolability. I do think that that's something that could unlock a bunch of stuff. And this is just one of many things on that list that I think is pretty critical. So I just would love to know what folks think about that idea.
I think contributor experience does have people who are capable of working on this. It's a question of bandwidth. Like, we're already using a tool to automate the management of GitHub membership now. And we plan on expanding that to the automation of all GitHub teams, and then expanding that to teams and ACLs. And then you could probably see something that kind of marries those with the concept of owners files, so that maybe owners files can reference GitHub teams instead of people directly, and that all gets unified a little bit. We could certainly try and spec it out and staff it through contractors, but I still feel like that SIG is the appropriate forum to project manage it.
Okay, so I'm not saying it's totally they don't have the skill set, but like the amount of need that we need around automation, we've been saying this for years now at this point, far outstrips the capacity of that SIG. And I don't think that, you know, one of the things that I don't think we are is super disciplined about actually prioritizing where the most critical things are across tooling in that particular SIG. I'm not, you know, and again, I think it's the appropriate SIG for it. I just think that, like, you know, it's very easy for us to say, hey, there should be a contribX thing. That doesn't mean that it'll get done. I think we should face that when things like this come up in the steering committee. That's the point I'm trying to make.
I guess I like saying that it should get done generally in open source means you're going to commit the resources to do it. And so I feel like DIMS has started that effort by committing himself to it personally. If you'd like to have George commit the CNCF to it through contractors, that'd be welcomed. But I'm sure like SIG testing would probably have some concerns as well to make sure that that functions appropriately with all of the automation that we've crafted around that.
Right. The thing that I put together yesterday was like one shell script and one CSV file, and then you put that into the Excel sheet and you're done. And we just have to do it like every 3 months or so. And so we don't really need anything more than this right now. It was just trying to get to the data was hard before, and over a period of time that we have enough stuff in DevStats to be able to do this now. We were not able to do this before. So that's the good news there. Plus, Joe, we did a few more things in DevStats. Like since we identified that India and China are, we are trying to attract more people from there. So what we did was, in some of the graphs, we asked the CNCF contractor to add the country field. So you could see from China how many people were doing what kind of contributions. So that helped, push some more stuff from there. So hopefully that will help in the in the KubeCon that's coming up over there too. So definitely we need to do more of those.
And I just had one other. Sorry, one other real quick thing around this. Brian had mentioned that we have too many owners files. Yeah, I don't know that we have a clear policy or vision for how they are supposed to be used when it comes to how many versus not enough. I think that there had been a push or a mandate that at some point that we tried to push as many owners files down to the leaves of trees as possible to avoid hitting the same 7 people in the root owners file of KK. And that's probably what has led to some of the propagation of owners files, but I'm still not sure we have the appropriate level of coverage there to prevent that from happening. And anyway.
I know how the existing owners files were created, so I can talk to that. I mean, it was a combination. There was an initial automated pass to try to distill who was contributing and who was reviewing to individual files, and that auto-generated a bunch of files, and then there was some manual fix up and deduping and elimination of noise for people who just did one-off PRs and things like that. But effectively, it was some folks in contribX, Garrett and Antoine and some other folks who took their best stab and tried to get TLs to cull, other obvious people who shouldn't be there and things like that. But where we never really got the sub-project owners to sort of take over the maintenance of those files. So I think from my perspective, having like one top level file per subproject, and then say, well, if the subproject thinks they need more, they can create more and manage those. Makes a lot of sense. And centralizing again the set of approvers for the subproject, I think would simplify a lot. You know, there are some large subprojects that may need more owners files than that, but for sure we don't need 5,000.
I think just to double down on what Brian just said, I think there's a difference between numbers of owner files and the number of owner files with unique sort of like random ass grab bags of people, right? I think we have a lot of owners files with grab bags of people. If we actually had a more disciplined way to actually identify that, hey, this is part of this sub project, here are the people who are approvers on this sub project, you know, that would probably simplify the cognitive load for people to understand this stuff a lot better.
Right. And I guess that's been part of the push to make sure that every SIG has all of their sub-projects enumerated through owners files. I've been able to automate that from like to ensure that at least every repo is covered, but I don't really know how you can even automate that on a like subdirectories of KK level.
What I would do is I would say we want to minimize the number of owner files that have individuals named and don't have teams named, because if you're naming a team, then you're actually managing this stuff in bulk, and then we can actually use those teams as keys for sub projects. I mean, like even extending the do we have sub project as a separate field in owners? I know we had talked about that. Did that ever happen?
We do not yet. No.
Yeah, because that would be good, because then it's like we could say, well, how many owners files do we have that have more than just a sub project as the thing in the owners file?
Mm-hmm.
And that'd be a bad smell.
I agree. So to me, it feels like there's some level of documentation. Actually, before I keep talking, Brandon, I thought you had something you wanted to add to this conversation. Maybe I misheard. Nope.
No.
Okay. I think we collectively agree that there should be better policies for owner files than there are right now. If anybody here wants to take an AI to actually write those down, then maybe as a next step, we can figure out how to best implement automation for those and where the appropriate staffing for that could come from. It is unfortunately not something I personally have the bandwidth for. Okay, moving on.
I just want to say, I said it in chat also, that I think this would be the kind of thing that the role board would be good for. Like there's a bunch of meaty automation stuff that could be done. It's probably not obvious to people that there is this need. Almost certainly we would get a volunteer to work on it if it were made more visible.
So the last topic I had on the agenda was, according to our wonderful new documented working group process, in order for me to create a working group, I need to get approval from chairs from all of the involved SIGs, and I need a majority vote from the steering committee. So I sent an email to the steering list, I think it was Monday this week, with the charter. Has everybody here had a chance to take a look at the charter for the working group? I linked it in the chat. So this is
I was able to review, Aaron. I didn't comment explicitly, but yeah, I was able to review.
Okay. So the only objection I've heard thus far was Tim pointing out that, yeah, it's weird that a working group has a charter. Thus far, no working groups have had charters or aren't required to. And like I said, we wanted to be really specific and formal because we feel like it's important to get this stuff right. In the same way that the product security team is trying to be very diligent about, who has this level of authority, we want that same caution being taken with people who operate the project infrastructure. So, for example, although right now the majority of people showing up to this working group are from one company, we would really like to live in a world where it's more than one company, and in fact that it's held to the same majority representation rules that the product security team, steering committee, code of conduct committee, and other groups are held to. So we would look to bring people from other companies on. We like the idea that the product security team has of vetting people for an established period of time prior to adding them as sub-project owners. And I gave us a slightly different voting process for sub-project creation and ownership, whereby the organizers of the working group, which is DIMS and myself, vote alongside with all of the other existing sub-project owners when it comes to nominating new people for sub-project ownership.
So you're talking about sub-projects and onboarding people over time and things like that. That makes it sound more like along the entity that is owning and managing resources, which sounds more SIG-like to me.
So the thought was we wanted to start as a working group, and if it makes sense to have all of this stuff happening under the umbrella of one SIG on an ongoing basis, we can convert to a SIG in the way that SIG Cloud Provider did. However, we have also explicitly called out which SIGs seem to be responsible or direct consumers of the different pieces of infrastructure, and it could also be that we decide to ultimately disband and leave ownership of those sub-projects to the individual SIGs. So we called out that like GCR and GCB, for example, are primarily the responsibility of SIG release, whereas like GKE and the PROW stuff is probably the responsibility of SIG testing. So if we ultimately find, as we work through all of this, that we can't untangle everything clearly into specific SIGs, then we can revisit whether this should turn into a SIG and extract ownership of that code to this SIG.
Plus, some of the stuff we can ship off to CNCF also. They let them manage, access and whatever else is needed. So hopefully we don't have to become a SIG. That would be the good news. And hopefully we'll stick to the, at least 6 months or 9 months, and we should be done by that time.
Yeah, and this was another area, much like Tim's concerns over SIG Cloud Provider not having its out-of-tree extraction happening fast enough, and Joe's concerns that we're not automating the things that we want to automate fast enough. We have concerns that we're not going to extract this project infrastructure from Google's hands fast enough because there are not enough people not from Google showing up to take this work on. And so although we aspire to have this done in 6 months, it could take longer if we don't have more resources being committed to this effort. All right, that's everything. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. One concern I'd have about this not being like a long-lived group is like having like account authority and auditing those accounts is actually like something that should be centralized across all these different. I mean, I could go to the CNCF or whatever, but it does seem like the custodianship is kind of a long-term, not high bandwidth, but high responsibility job, sort of like the GitHub owners.
Yeah,
admins.
I agree. So like the product security team is really the only other model I have to go on for that. And as far as I know, they're not really a formal working group or entity in that way. We would be, like, if you are that central authority for some level of credentials, we'd be happy to delegate to you for that.
Yeah, I mean, we've had intentions of like figuring out how to become a committee. It just hasn't happened yet.
And I think we agree with that. That again is why I tried to at least draft up a charter that was more formal sounding. I don't think we want to impose too much friction until we actually have traction. But we are happy to introduce whatever level of formalism is required. Does the steering committee agree this is an appropriate level of formalism for now? And can I move forward with working group creation, or are there any objections here?
I guess my main, obviously the work needs to get done. And from that perspective, doesn't matter too much whether it's a working group or a SIG. I'm just worried that it will further muddy the waters about what a working group actually is, and people are already super confused about that. Like if we said a working group is just a forum for collaboration and you have a Slack channel and a mailing list and a meeting time, that's very different from what you're proposing.
I guess when I talk about sub-projects, maybe I'm using the wrong word here. It's more like a group of people who are focused around the successful stewardship of some piece of infrastructure that we assume will end up, belonging to the SIG that owns that piece of infrastructure.
Maybe it's just a naming thing. Maybe it's like Kubernetes infra CNCF extraction working group. Maybe that's where we're getting, because that's what you seem to be describing, and that I think that would at least reduce Brian's.
I mean, I did try to call out in our charter that our sole purpose is the extraction of infrastructure to the CNCF, and we intend to disband when that's done. Like, we're responsible for creating the processes along the way that make sure that it is going to be taken care of when it is extracted, but we don't intend that to be a long-lived effort.
Right. Just as an example, one of the items that we need to work on is get a GCR repository where folks outside of Google can push stuff to it and have enough, and eventually it should end up with SIG release and not with our team. Then we need, so and then the other example is the APT and YUM repositories need to be extracted out from where they are now, and they need to go to SIG release as well. So we rely on people who are already members of these other groups, other SIGs, as part of this working group to actually do the work. And the only other thing that we had was, do we need a Git repository? And then we said, we're going to use the kates.io repository right for now. And if we need anything more, then we will work with one of the existing SIGs and get a repository that we can use. So that was the only other thing that we could think of.
Do you feel less concerned, Brian, if it's with that scope of work?
Yeah, and the scope of the work doesn't concern me, saying that, well, we're going to extract these things and they're going to be owned by the SIGs that effectively manage them currently. Sounds totally reasonable and makes sense. I guess it's the degree to which this looks SIG-like from the proposed charter, I think, is likely to engender confusion. If there are parts of this that we don't need, like sub-project creation or whatnot, if we could just cull those from the document, I think that would be good. Like other working groups, if they're gonna, if something needs to be designed and proposed, that would go through the ordinary KEP process, and whoever proposed the KEP would be driving it. So, does the whole effort, do we need to specify TLs in this document or sub-projects or things like that? I was hoping that we would keep working groups more lightweight as these forums for collaboration, and to the degree that it looks more like a SIG, then I think in some sense that's a regression in terms of where we've been trying to go with working groups.
So how about this? So if we let us go in as a SIG, as a working group, and 3 months down the line we see that okay, work just expanded and there's no way we're going to finish in the next 3 months or so, then we convert into a SIG at that point.
Yeah, I mean, that's totally fine. I think I'd also be fine with it. Yes, I mean, that's totally fine.
Okay, so Aaron and Dims, can you guys take a shot at making it feel less SIG-like, and then I can follow up for you, or Brian can.
Okay. It sounds like maybe the word sub-project is one of the main sticking points here. So I do want to make sure we document sort of how how we pick people that we deem responsible enough to be stewards of this infrastructure. Do you mind if I talk about like?
But the stewards are going to be members of the individual SIGs, no?
Right.
Maybe if we could just rely on like time in the project or where they sit on the contributor ladder as a level of trust.
Well, so what I'm wondering, I guess a couple of things. One is if we need policies about level of trust on these roles permanently, not just for the duration of the working group, maybe that needs to go somewhere else. Or maybe we do need a committee more like the security effort to own these things long term. And I would expect it to also apply to, for example, our GitHub admins, which have a very high level of access to our GitHub resources, which arguably are amongst the most critical things on the project. So I'm just wondering if there needs to be something separate from the working group efforts to do the transition that we need to govern these kinds of resources going forward. Does that make sense?
It does. We defer to SIGs for the creation of subprojects owned by those SIGs, but we're going to recommend that the way those subprojects choose their owners is via a policy that we have taken from the product security team as inspiration, which includes time on project and actual contributions to project. Does that feel a little less SIG-like?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we need to wordsmith a little bit more to remove the sigginess of it all, I guess.
All right. I will work with Dims on that. That's all that I have, and we have 4 minutes left. Anybody has anything else? Okay. Thank you, everybody, for your time, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Aaron.
Thanks.